Matthew Harper adjusted the collar of his faded denim jacket as he wandered through the cluttered aisles of the flea market. The air smelled of dust and old leather, a familiar comfort for someone who spent his weekends hunting for relics of the past. At 28, he was a self-proclaimed cineasta, though his YouTube channel of short films barely scraped 100 views. Today, he needed inspiration, something raw, something real, to spark his next project. The market sprawled across a cracked parking lot on the edge of town, its tables groaning under chipped china, rusted tools, and yellowed paperbacks. Matthew's eyes skimmed the usual junk until they landed on a cardboard box tucked beneath a sagging tarp. Inside, a jumble of VHS tapes spilled out, their handwritten labels smudged with age. He crouched, sifting through titles like Home Movies, 92 and Jenny's Wedding, until his fingers brushed against one that made him pause. It was a black cassette, no cover, just a peeling sticker with blocky red letters, "Do not watch." The warning scratched at his curiosity like a stray splinter. Matthew turned it over, inspecting the worn edges, no name, no date, just those words stark and commanding. He glanced up, searching for the vendor, but the table was unattended, a handwritten sign reading $1 each taped to the box. "Perfect," he muttered, fishing a crumpled dollar from his pocket. It was probably some kid's prank or a failed art project. Either way, it was a story waiting to be cracked open. He slipped the tape into his bag and headed home, the late afternoon sun dipping low behind the pines. His apartment was a cramped one bedroom above a laundromat, the hum of dryers a constant undertone. Matthew dropped his bag on the sagging couch and pulled out his find, holding it up to the flickering light of a bare bulb. The red letters seemed to pulse faintly, though he chalked it up to tired eyes. His old VCR sat in the corner, a thrift, store treasure he'd restored himself. He hadn't used it in weeks, but now it called to him like an itch he couldn't ignore. He popped the tape from its sleeve and hesitated, thumb hovering over the slot. "Do not watch." The warning looped in his head, absurd yet insistent. "What's the worst that could happen?" he said aloud, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. It was just a tape, grainy home videos or some B-movie gore at best. Still, his pulse ticked up as he slid it into the machine. The VCR whirred, a low mechanical groan, and the TV flickered to life with a burst of static. Matthew sank into the couch, remote in hand, ready to fast forward through whatever dull footage awaited. The screen settled, and an image blinked into focus. Not a title card or a shaky camcorder intro, but something else entirely. His breath caught as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the grainy picture. It was him, sitting in his kitchen, sipping coffee from the chipped blue mug he'd used that morning. The angle was wrong. Too high, too close, like the camera had been perched inside the wall. His grip tightened on the remote. This wasn't a prank. This was impossible. Matthew's heart thudded as the grainy image of himself flickered on the screen. He jabbed the stop button, and the VCR clunked to a halt, plunging the room into silence. The TV went black, reflecting his wide-eyed stare. He set the remote down, hands trembling slightly, and stood to pace the narrow strip of carpet between the couch and the coffee table. "This isn't real," he muttered, running a hand through his messy brown hair. "It's a trick. Someone's screwing with me." He circled back to the VCR, ejecting the tape with a sharp click. The cassette felt heavier now, the red "Do Not Watch" glaring up at him like an accusation. He turned it over, inspecting it again. Still no clues, no scratches, or hidden markings, just a cheap VHS, the kind he'd seen 100 times. But that footage, it wasn't stock video or a clever edit. It was him, in his kitchen, wearing the same grey hoodie he'd tossed in the laundry that morning. Matthew glanced toward the kitchen doorway, half expecting to see a camera lens glinting in the shadows. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint buzz of the laundromat downstairs. He grabbed his phone and swept its flashlight across the room, sealing corners, behind the fridge, under the sink. Nothing. No wires. No blinking lights. Just peeling paint and a stale coffee smell. "Okay, think," he said, sinking back onto the couch. Maybe he'd filmed himself and forgotten, some late-night experiment after too much cheap beer. But he hadn't touched the camcorder in weeks, and it didn't shoot in that shaky VHS grain. Plus, that angle, too high, too invasive, couldn't have come from his tripod. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion tugging at him, but curiosity gnawed harder. He slid the tape back into the VCR, thumb hovering over play. "One more look," he told himself, just to figure it out. The machine whirred alive again, and the screen crackled back to that impossible scene. Him at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, oblivious. The timestamp in the corner read 8:47 a.m., exactly when he'd been there today. His stomach twisted as the footage shifted, cutting to another shot. Now, he was in his living room, hunched over his laptop, editing a video. The angle came from above the bookshelf, where a camera would have been staring down at him. He remembered that moment, yesterday afternoon, struggling with a sound mix. The hoodie was gone, replaced by a faded Nirvana tee. On screen, he scratched his neck, oblivious to the unseen lens. Matthew's mouth went dry. This wasn't a one-off. Someone or something had been watching him for days. The tape rolled on, each scene sharper than the last. Him brushing his teeth in the bathroom, the camera peering from the vent. Him sprawled on the couch, scrolling his phone, filmed from behind the TV. Then the worst one, him asleep in bed last night, the shot hovering inches above his face. His chest rose and fell, eyes twitching under lids, while the camera lingered, unblinking. Matthew hit stop again, the VCR grinding as the tape ejected. He stumbled to the bedroom, yanking the blinds shut and flipping on every light. The room looked normal, unmade bed, scattered clothes, his old film posters curling at the edges, but that footage had turned it alien, a stage for some unseen director. He checked the ceiling, the vents, even under the mattress. Nothing. Back, in the living room, he stared at the tape on the coffee table. It sat there, silent and mocking, daring him to press play again. His mind raced. Call the cops? A friend? But what would he say? "Hey, I found a tape of myself and I don't know who filmed it." They'd think he was unhinged. He grabbed a beer from the fridge, popping the cap with shaky fingers. One thing was clear. He couldn't let it go. Not yet. Whatever this was, he'd crack it, because if he didn't, it felt like it might crack him first. Matthew took a long swig of his beer, the cold bitterness grounding him as he stared at the VHS tape on the coffee table. The apartment hummed with the familiar drone of the laundromat below, but it did little to ease the prickling at the back of his neck. He'd checked every corner, every shadow, no cameras, no explanation. Yet the images burned in his mind, him sleeping, filmed from above like prey under a microscope. He couldn't shake the feeling that pressing play again was a mistake, but not pressing it felt worse. He set the bottle down, glass clinking against wood, and grabbed the tape. "One more time," he muttered, sliding it into the VCR. The bay machine groaned to life, and the TV flickered, static buzzing before the picture snapped into focus. It picked up where he'd left off, him asleep, the camera hovering too close. His on-screen self shifted, mumbling something incoherent, and then the scene cut. Now it was morning again, him in the kitchen, pouring cereal, the clock on the wall. Ticking past 9 a.m. today. The angle was different, lower, as if shot from the counter's edge. Matthew leaned forward, squinting at the grainy details. Something was off. In the corner of the frame, near the doorway, a shadow flickered. Just for a second, a smudge of darkness that didn't match the light. He rewound, frame by frame, breath hitching as he paused on it. There, a silhouette, vague and humanoid, standing just beyond the threshold. It was too tall, too thin, its edges blurring into the static. Matthew's pulse quickened. He hadn't seen anyone there this morning. He'd been alone, hadn't he? The tape rolled forward, cutting to him in the living room, pacing with his phone's flashlight after the first viewing. The camera watched. From above the couch, catching every twitch of his face. And there in the background, the figure again, closer now, lurking near the bookshelf. Its head tilted slightly as if studying him. Matthew's beer turned sour in his stomach. Each new scene brought it nearer. Him in the bathroom, splashing water on his face. The figure loomed in the hallway, half hidden by the doorframe. Him grabbing the beer from the fridge. It stood by the sink, motionless, a dark stain against the peeling wallpaper. The closer it got, the clearer it became. No face, no features, just a void shaped like a person, absorbing the light around it. Matthew hit stop, the VCR whirring as the tape popped out. He stumbled back, knocking the beer bottle over. It rolled off the table, fizzing onto the carpet, but he barely noticed. His eyes darted around the room. Bookshelf, doorway, sink. Empty. Silent. But the air felt thicker now, pressing against his chest. He grabbed his phone, fingers fumbling as he dialed his friend Jake, a fellow film geek who might humor him. Voicemail. "Hey, Jake, it's Matt. I found this tape. It's got me on it, and there's something else. Call me back, okay?" He hung up, voice echoing in his head. The tape sat there, daring him to look again. He wanted to smash it, toss it out the window, but his hands wouldn't move. That figure, it wasn't just watching him on screen. It felt like it was watching him now, waiting for his next move. He turned on every light in the apartment, the buzz of the bulbs drowning out the silence. Sleep wasn't an option tonight. Matthew didn't sleep. The lights stayed on, casting harsh shadows across the apartment as he sat on the couch, staring at the VCR like it might lunge at him. The spilled beer had dried into a sticky patch on the carpet, its faint sour smell mingling with the stale air. Every creak of the building, every hum from the laundromat below made him flinch. He turned the TV off, but its blank screen seemed to watch him back, a dark mirror he couldn't escape. By morning, his eyes burned with exhaustion and the figure from the tape haunted every blink, tall, faceless, creeping closer. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, avoiding the vent where the camera had perched in that footage. As he straightened, towel in hand, something caught his eye in the mirror, a flicker of shadow behind him, near the open door. He spun around, heart hammering. Nothing, just the hallway dim and empty. "Get it together, Matt," he whispered, gripping the sink. He was jumping at ghosts now, seeing things that weren't there. Or were they? The tape had planted doubt deep in his gut, and it was spreading like rot. He shuffled to the kitchen, brewing coffee to shake the fog from his head. The machine gurgled, and he glanced out the window. Grey clouds hung low, smudging the daylight. Into something bleak. He tried Jake again. Still voicemail. "Dude, it's Matt. Seriously, call me. I'm freaking out here." He hung up, pacing to the living room, where the tape waited on the coffee table. He couldn't bring himself to touch it, not yet. Instead, he grabbed his phone and set it to record, propping it against a stack of film books. "If you're gonna mess with me," he muttered, "let's see you on my terms." He hit play on the VCR, the familiar whir filling the room as the screen crackled to life. The footage resumed, him pacing last night, phone flashlight sweeping the shadows. The figure lingered by the bookshelf, closer than before, its head tilted like it was listening. Matthew glanced at his phone screen. Nothing but him and the TV, no shadow, no static. He frowned, rewinding the tape. The figure was there again, undeniable, but his phone showed only empty space. The next scene loaded, him grabbing the beer, the figure by the sink. He checked the window above it now. His reflection stared back, haggard and unshaven, but for a split second something else flickered. A dark smudge, tall and thin, right behind his shoulder. He whipped around, knocking over a mug. It shattered on the floor, but the kitchen was empty. His breath came fast, shallow. The phone kept recording, oblivious. He stopped the tape, ejecting it with a trembling hand. "This isn't real," he said, louder than he meant to. "It's in my head. It's gotta be." But the words felt hollow. He'd seen it. On the tape, in the mirror, in the window. Not clear enough to swear by, but enough to claw at his sanity. He swept the apartment again, checking locks, peering into corners. The figure didn't show, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, like it was holding its breath. He sank onto the couch, staring at the phone's footage. Just him, alone, freaking out over nothing. Maybe he was losing it. Stress, sleeplessness, a trick. Of the light, there had to be an explanation. His phone buzzed, startling him. A text from Jake. "Busy today, what's up?" Matthew typed back, fingers clumsy. "Found a tape. It's me, but I didn't film it. There's something in it. Help!" He hit send, waiting for a reply that didn't come. The tape sat there, red letters mocking him. He needed answers, real ones, before he broke completely. Matthew sat on the couch, thumb hovering over his phone screen, waiting for Jake's reply. The text sat unanswered, the little delivered tag taunting him. He tossed the phone aside, letting it clatter onto the coffee table next to the VHS tape. The apartment was a cage of light, every bulb blazing, but it didn't stop, the chill creeping up his spine. He rubbed his arms, the skin prickling despite the hoodie he'd thrown on to ward off the cold that wasn't there. He stood, pacing to the kitchen to clean up the shattered mug from earlier. The shards glinted under the fluorescence, and as he swept them into a dustpan, he froze. His keys, the ones he'd left on the counter last night, were gone. He checked. The table, the sink, even the floor. Nothing. A faint jingle came from the living room. He stepped back, broom in hand, and there they were, dangling from the edge of the bookshelf, swaying slightly like they'd just been placed. "What the hell?" he breathed, snatching them up. The metal was ice cold, stinging his fingers. He dropped them onto the coffee table, right beside the tape, and backed away. His eyes darted to the phone, still recording, its tiny red light steady. He grabbed it, scrolling through the footage. Just him pacing, him in the kitchen, him sweeping. No keys moving, no hands, no figure, just empty space where something should have been. The TV flickered on behind him, a burst of static slicing through the silence. Matthew spun around, heart lurching. The screen glowed with white noise, the volume low but insistent, like a whisper he couldn't quite catch. He hadn't touched the remote. It was still on the couch, untouched. He lunged for it, mashing the power button, but the static held, buzzing louder. The VCR whirred, the tape slot empty, yet the sound felt alive, pressing against his eardrums. He yanked the TV's plug from the wall, and the noise died, leaving a ringing in his ears. "This isn't happening," he said, voice cracking. He stumbled to the bedroom, slamming the door and sinking onto the bed. Sleep clawed at him. He hadn't rested in over a day, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure, faceless and looming. He pulled the blanket over his head, a childish shield, and drifted into a fitful doze. The dream came fast. He was on the couch, the tape playing, but the screen showed him sleeping in bed. Right now, the figure stood at his feet, its void face tilting down, closer until its edges brushed his skin. He jolted awake, gasping, the blanket tangled around his legs. The room was dark, too dark. The lights he'd left on were off, every single. When he fumbled for his phone, the flashlight beam slicing through the gloom. The bedroom door creaked open an inch, though he'd shut it tight. His breath hitched as he crept forward, peering into the living room. The TV was back on, unplugged cord dangling, static hissing softly. The tape was in the VCR again, despite him leaving it on the table. Matthew grabbed his laptop, hands shaking as he opened a browser. He typed VHS tape strange footage into a search bar, then refined it. Cursed tapes. A forum popped up, some obscure corner of the internet, called Analog Nightmares. He scrolled, eyes catching on a thread. Daniel Price, filmmaker missing since '87, rumored to trap things in his tapes, entities, not people. If you've got one, don't watch it twice. His stomach dropped. He clicked another post. It starts small. Stuff moves, you see it in corners. Then it gets in your head. Matthew slammed the laptop shut, the words searing into him. He'd watched it more than twice, way more. A low scrape echoed from the kitchen, like a chair dragging across tile. He grabbed the phone, flashlight, trembling, and stepped out. The room was still, but his keys were on the floor now near the sink. And there, in the window's reflection, the figure stood, tall, dark, closer than ever. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The static hummed again, a quiet promise of what was coming. The static's hum pulsed in Matthew's ears as he stood frozen, the phone's flashlight beam trembling across the kitchen floor. The keys glinted where they'd fallen, a cold reminder of the impossible. He didn't dare look at the window again, didn't need to. The reflection had burned into his mind, the figure, tall and faceless, inches behind him. His breath came in shallow bursts, fogging faintly in the air that had turned frigid. He tightened his grip on the phone, the only tether to reality he had left. The scrape came again, sharper this time, from the living room. Matthew forced his legs to move, each step a battle against the weight pressing on his chest. The static grew louder as he crossed the threshold, the TV glowing with its unplugged cord, swaying like a pendulum. The VHS tape sat in the VCR, its red letters glaring up at him, "Do not watch." He hadn't put it back. He knew he hadn't. He grabbed the remote from the couch, hands slick with sweat, and aimed it at the TV. Nothing. The static held a wall of noise that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Then, without warning, the VCR clicked and the tape began to play. Matthew stumbled back, the flashlight beam jerking wildly as the screen flared to life. It was him, right now, standing in the living room, phone raised, the grainy footage mirroring his every move. The angle came from above, near the ceiling light that flickered weakly. His on-screen self looked terrified, eyes darting, just as he felt them darting now. But there, in the background, the figure loomed, closer than in the window, its void shape blotting out the bookshelf. It didn't move, didn't sway, just stood, watching. Matthew's throat tightened. "This isn't real," he croaked. But the words drowned in the static's roar. The figure shifted on screen, a slow tilt of its head, and he felt it, a prickle on his neck, like eyes boring into him from behind. He spun around, flashlight sweeping the room, empty. Just the couch, the coffee table, the spilled beer stain. But the air was heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. The footage cut, and a new scene loaded, him asleep from the night before, the camera hovering over his bed. The figure was there, at his feet, closer than in the dream. Then another, and cut, him pacing last night, flashlight in hand, the figure by the bookshelf, cut again, him in the kitchen sweeping up the mug, the figure by the sink. Each scene replayed his life, and each time it was nearer, its presence growing sharper, darker. The screen flickered, and the latest image returned. Him now, in the living room. The figure was no longer by the bookshelf. It stood behind him, inches away, its faceless head looming over his shoulder. Matthew's knees buckled. He didn't turn around, he couldn't, but the flashlight beam shook as he aimed it at the TV. The static screeched, a high-pitched wail, and he felt it. A cold brush against his arm like fingers made of shadow. "No!" he shouted, lunging for the VCR. He yanked the tape out, the machine groaning in protest, and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a crack, plastic splintering, but the TV didn't stop. The footage looped, him throwing the tape, the figure still there, closer now, its edges bleeding into his own shadow on screen. The lights went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The flashlight died too, the phone screen blanking despite its full battery. Matthew's breath hitched, the only sound left in the suffocating silence. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the kitchen. He pressed himself against the wall, heart slamming against his ribs. The TV flared back on, unplugged and impossible, the static softer now, almost a whisper. The tape lay broken on the floor, yet the screen showed him, cowering against the wall right where he stood. The figure was gone from the frame. A shadow stretched across the carpet in front of him, tall and thin, cast by nothing he could see. He felt it behind him, a cold weight, and the static hissed one word, Matthew. Matthew's name lingered in the air, hissed through the static like a taunt. He pressed harder against the wall, the plaster cold against his back, as the shadow stretched longer across the carpet. The TV glowed faintly, its unplugged cord a coiled snake on the floor, and the broken tape lay in pieces near the couch. Yet the screen still held that image. Him, cowering, alone. The figure was gone from the footage, but he felt it, a presence so close it stole the warmth from his skin. He slid down the wall, knees buckling, and clutched his dead phone like a lifeline. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. Thick, suffocating, alive with intent. "What do you want?" he rasped, voice barely a whisper. No answer came. Just the soft crackle of static looping his name. Matthew. Matthew. It wasn't a recording. It was here, in the room, speaking. Through the TV, he crawled toward the coffee table, fumbling for the keys he'd dropped earlier. The metal bit into his palm, grounding him as he staggered to his feet. He had to get out, away from the apartment, the tape, that thing. He stumbled to the door, yanking it open. But the hallway light flickered and died, leaving a void beyond. The threshold. The static followed him, a low hum echoing off the walls. Matthew bolted back inside, slamming the door and locking it. No escape, no help. He grabbed his laptop from the bedroom, its battery icon blinking at 10%. The forum from earlier, Analog Nightmares, was still open. He scrolled past the thread about Daniel Price, fingers trembling as he clicked a link to an archived article. The headline hit him like a punch. Local filmmaker vanishes after experimental project, 1987. The grainy photo showed a man in his 30s, sharp jaw, wild hair, standing with a clunky camcorder. Daniel Price. The text was sparse. Price claimed his latest work captured more than images. Something alive, he told colleagues. After his disappearance, police found his studio empty, save for a box of unmarked tapes. Matthew's eyes darted to the broken VHS. One of those tapes. It had to be. A user comment below the article chilled him further. If you've got a Price tape, it's not just footage, it's a cage. Something's trapped in there, and watching it lets it see you back. Another post. Burn it, bury it, doesn't matter, it finds a way. Matthew's stomach lurched. He'd watched it too many times, opened the cage too wide. He grabbed the tape's remains, shoving the splintered plastic and tangled ribbon into a trash bag. The static spiked, a shriek that made him drop the bag. The TV screen flickered, showing the kitchen now, empty, but the keys were back on the counter, gleaming under the light. He hadn't put them there. He tied the bag shut and ran to the stove, lighting a burner with shaky hands. "You're done," he muttered, holding the bag over the flame. The plastic melted, acrid smoke curling up, but the tape didn't burn. It reformed, edges snapping back together like a living thing. Matthew yelped, dropping it onto the tile. The VCR whirred behind him, and he turned to see the tape back in the slot, pristine red letters glaring. The screen shifted, him standing in the kitchen, staring at the tape, right now. The figure wasn't there, but the static hissed louder, a chorus of whispers he couldn't decipher. He sank to the floor, the truth clawing at him. Daniel Price hadn't just filmed something, he'd trapped it, and now it was free, tethered to him through the tape. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was here, rewriting the rules of his world. The keys jangled faintly, sliding off the counter on their own. The lights dimmed, and the static softened into a low, deliberate laugh. The laugh from the static curled around Matthew like smoke, low and guttural, as the kitchen lights flickered to a dull hum. He stared at the tape, whole again in the VCR. Its red "Do Not Watch" label a cruel joke. The trash bag lay melted on the floor, useless, and the keys jittered across the tile, coming to rest near his feet. He didn't pick them up. He couldn't. The apartment wasn't his anymore. It belonged to whatever Daniel Price had caged in that footage, and it was done playing subtle. Matthew grabbed his phone, still dead, and the laptop, its screen frozen, on the forum page. He stuffed them into a backpack, hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. The static pulsed, a heartbeat in the walls, and he felt the figure's presence, not behind him, not in a reflection, but everywhere, a weight that pressed his lungs flat. He had to leave. Now. He snatched the tape from the VCR, ignoring the cold that seared his fingers, and bolted for the door. The hallway light was still out, but he didn't care. He stumbled down the stairs, the static fading to a distant buzz as he burst into the cool night air. The street was empty, the laundromats, neon sign flickering below. He ran, backpack slapping against his spine, until his legs burned and his breath came in ragged gasps. A vacant lot loomed ahead, overgrown with weeds and littered with junk. An old tire, a rusted bike frame. Perfect. Matthew dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with bare hands. The tape had to stay here, buried far from him. He dug until his nails bled, the earth cold and unyielding, then shoved the cassette into the hole. "Stay down," he hissed, piling soil over it. The static was gone now, replaced by the rustle of wind through dry grass. He stood, wiping mud on his jeans, and dared to hope it was over. He didn't go home. The apartment was a trap, its walls alive with that thing's eyes. Instead, he checked into a cheap motel 2 miles away, the kind with stained carpets and buzzing vending machines. The clerk barely glanced at his muddy clothes, just slid him a key and went back to his phone. Room 12 smelled of mildew, but the silence was a balm. Matthew collapsed onto the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. No shadows moved, no keys jangled, just his own breathing, ragged but steady. Sleep came in fits, broken by flashes of the figure, its void face tilting, its shadow stretching. He woke to a faint crackle, heart lurching, and grabbed the motel radio from the nightstand. Static spilled from it, soft but unmistakable, though the dial was set to off. He yanked the plug, the sound dying, and buried his face in his hands. It wasn't over. It might never be. Miles away, in the vacant lot, a stray dog nosed through. The weeds, its ears pricking at a low hum. The ground shifted slightly, a patch of dirt sinking, then rising. A hand broke through, not Matthew's, not alive. A stranger's, pale and trembling, clutching the tape. The cassette gleamed in the moonlight, red letters stark against the black plastic. The static hummed again, louder now, threading through the night like a thread pulled tight. In room 12, Matthew didn't hear it, not yet, but the radio's unplugged cord twitched just once, and the air grew cold.